in Skype. Let's see, Jay, a fellow I've spoken to before. Problem is, he won't let me message him.
Actually, Nephilim, if you don't mind, I kind of wanted to just ask Jackson a question here, because Jackson and I had some really good discussions before, a couple of them actually.
Yeah, man, it's open table, so go for it.
I just wanted to ask Jackson real quick, and then certainly Nephi, you can jump in, and RJ, how you doing, brother?
Hey, glad you made it.
I tried to get on Skype.
How did you get the link?
Well, they sent. Well, the point is, I had to load up Skype. I was trying Skype on my PC, and it had to send a message to me by my text to my cell phone, and apparently it was going by Pony Express because it never got there. So this is way much easier.
I'm glad you did. So
Google Hangouts are so much easier. They're old fart proof.
Well, glad for coming. Thanks for coming. Okay, so Standing, you wanted to talk to Jackson Mead about something. You wanted to ask.
Yeah, I just wanted to pick his brain a little and see what he thinks to, and just hear some of his ideas, his objections to, the Dr. Jensen's created heterozygosity hypotheses, because we were discussing before that if the ancestors to, say, modern species possessed millions of heterozygous nuclear DNA sites, I was proposing that new species would then arise naturally, right, through the processes of, say, recombination and gene conversion. I think it would be obvious and evident that new nuclear chromosome combinations could actually arise each generation, but when these processes, say, involve millions of heterozygous sites, changes in invisible traits, I would say, are almost guaranteed to appear each generation, right? So how would you feel about that, Jackson? And is that something that you see as a plausible hypothesis, or something that's improbable? Go ahead.
Well, I have now had the pleasure of seeing you hash this idea out with biologists, and none of them seem convinced by this idea. And so I also don't seem convinced by that idea. Also, in Jensen's idea, has he ever applied it to any living systems?
Has Dr. Jensen applied the
his model of heterozygosity to any living systems? Do we have any systems today that might model that?
Which paper is that?
Or there? Oh, that's the one. That's the one. Well, great. Now I'll have to find
a lot of Jensen in my bibliography.
Well, I think
Steve, could you grab that article for RJ? I don't remember which one it is.
I think based on the predictions and the expectations of, say, the non-coding DNA and its genome-wide functionality, that would be a prediction, say, proven based on the created heterozygosity model, because if those nuclear DNA differences are functional, front-loaded DNA differences, like we're saying, and we see that the majority of our genome is, say, functional to some extent, or is at least not idle, well, that would be a confirmation of that. Why? So whether or not we're testing it on actual, say, species, obviously we're looking at mitochondrial DNA rates, nuclear DNA rates.
Understanding why? Why is that? Why is that a fulfillment of a prediction of heterozygosity?
Well, based on the idea that God front-loaded, created heterozygosity into the created kinds, we would expect that the majority of our genome is not based on evolutionary leftovers, based on junk, but based on what I'm saying of the processes of.
Would they have had ALUs?
In the original created kinds?
Yeah, of humans.
I'm not too sure.
10% of us is ALUs. Either they were in the created kind or they occurred afterwards. If they occurred afterwards, under what circumstance did they occur? I don't think Jensen has ventured an opinion on actual DNA, has he?
Well, have you read his paper on Darwin's finches as being
again, I got
heterozygosity. I think I have it here.
None that's specifically in it. Everything from his 2010 papers, New Frontiers in Animal Class, to response to no replacement of Darwin in Answers in Genesis in 2018. So there's a lot. And then there's some co-authored papers too. So it's a big swath. There's one he did with Jason Lyle in 2016. Origin of eukaryotic species, genotype and phenotype diversities, genetic clocks, population growth curves, and comparative nuclear genome analysis suggest created heterozygosity in combination with natural processes as a major mechanism. Is that the one we're talking about?
You know what? I actually have it right here in my binder. I'm trying to look for it, but it was new species arising with the finches based on a shift from heterozygosity to homozygosity, which would say be expected if we're saying that that's the main basis for
what sources is he citing?
Arising.
What sources are does he cite to authoritatively saying that these are shifting from heterozygosity to homozygosity?
Well, I'm flipping through
a pretty impressive claim there. So I'd like to see the documentation.
The Behrmanologists have already accepted all of the finch species as natural monobehrmans. So in effect, they've thrown in the towel on natural common descent, at least for those. So is that really helping the argument much?
Well, in regard, I'm flipping through to get the exact sources that he's used, but in regards to the science of what I've said in regards to, say, recombination and gene conversion, because correct me if I'm wrong, recombination would state that chunks of DNA are swapped between pairs of the same chromosome to generate
homologous chromosomes, yes.
But which problem do you have in the science aspect of this created heterozygosity? Because you guys always complain about,
there's no created heterozygosity. That's the first issue.
I think it's expected from creation that God would build genetic diversification into the genome. I mean, why would God want every human being to look identical? That'd be a
this is way beyond an individual instance. This is arranged, and I would gather that it would be so broad that could accommodate the speciation that's required in the flood model. But I'm just asking, Standing, on this paper, did you source check the validity of his source citations to see whether or not he was fairly representing their content?
From when I originally read it, and what I concluded was that it was a fair assessment.
You read the original papers that he was citing?
I've got it right here. So there's two. It's a bombshell for replacing Darwin and a second bombshell for replacing Darwin. And
what do you mean by a bombshell for replacing Darwin?
Because what he's saying is the parental species of these finches was relatively heterozygous, and the new species shifted to a state of increased homozygosity, which is exactly what we're asking. Darwin predicted.
So that's what we're asking. Where's the source for that?
Yeah, what does he cite for that claim?
So it's a 2018 study of Darwin's finches, okay?
What's
and
the
actual source.
Did you look that one up to see if the content matched up?
Well, I'm looking here at all the different sources that were.
Well, what's the source for that? What's the 2018 source name?
Okay.
Yeah, what's the author of the paper?
Sanjeet Lamikhani, Rapid Hybrid Speciation in Darwin's Finches, Science 359, number 6372.
Slow up. Rapid Hybrid Speciation. That should probably do it.
And Darwin's Finches found it.
Darwin's Finches.
Science, yeah.
That ought to find it.
Okay, now did you read that paper to see whether or not the content matched up or whether there was information that he might not be bringing up? Did you follow that up?
Well, like I said, I've been looking into this for a while. So originally, yes, but I haven't done it in a while. So I'm not going to lie to you and say, yeah, I've looked at it recently. Do you have the paper in front of you? And did you want to go
I have it in my bibliography. I'd have to look and see whether or not I got the PDF of it or not. Yes, Lamikhani, it's a 2018 article, brand new. Peter Grant and the Grants have got a huge amount of material on this. By the way, what did the article say about how rapid the hybrid speciation was and when that took place?
So what it says in the article, I believe, let me see, eight breeding pairs and 36 individuals were present on the island. That was during their most recent visit, I think in 2012, there were 8 breeding pairs and 23 individuals of generations 3 to 6. But in regards to the heterozygosity and homozygosity levels, I think, which is the most important part, it was, I think this is right from the actual paper you probably have on you. It says that a gradual increase in homozygosity was then observed over the next 5 generations as expected from the small number of breeding pairs, which is the 1 to 8 that I was just talking about.
Oh, is this the big bird lineage? Oh, are those those are the ones that are inbred, aren't they? Yeah, that would make sense because these are greatly inbred birds.
Didn't evolution predict 0.0001 finch species per year? But this
I have no idea.
Demonstrating more finch. Well, as Neff said earlier, isn't this a valid hypothesis based on the biblical model? Because why would God create clones if he had a command for us to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth?
This is again the chronology.
So, Nephi, how do you feel about that?
Well, I agree. I think that God built into the genome, of course, the ability to create diversity, and there's no reason when evolutionists don't have a stranglehold on that. It would seem logical to me that God doesn't want a world full of clones. So I think it's also necessary for. God knew in advance, of course, that human beings were going to fall into biological decay. And so there needs to be mechanisms in like repeats, genetic redundancy in the genome. And, the genome is highly redundant. And that creates the potential for the DNA repair mechanism to use backup copies of existing genes in order to continue as normal. We know about this process exists in genetics where a defunct gene caused but damaged by mutation can be epigenetically turned off and a backup of that gene turned on, and so things go on as normal. And I think that's a remarkable feature. It's a remarkable feature of the design of living things.
Well, and which means, based on what you're saying, to read, if there is, say, a considerable amount of information then stored, say, in the genome in this compressed hidden form, when this information is then, say, decompressed, deciphered, revealed, or even unscrambled, really, you could just call it whatever. Can this be used as evidence for evolution, since that information was obviously already stored in the genome, consistent with the biblical-based model?
So I don't think so, because
you had the original.
He asked me the question. Let me answer it, and then you guys can have the floor. I don't think so, because the existence of the DNA repair mechanism, which deals with this stuff, should not exist if evolution were true. The mechanism is designed to maintain the integrity of the molecule against random change, and that's what unguided natural random genetic mutations do. They make undirected, unguided, unintelligently directed changes to the DNA, but the repair mechanism exists to maintain the integrity of the molecule. It seems counterintuitive that if evolution is preceded by these random genetic mutations, then evolution would incorporate all the random mutation it could get its bloody hands on. It would never develop a system for thwarting random genetic mutation. Instead, it would suck up all the mutation it could get.
RJ,
let me finish. I'm almost done. I think it's counterintuitive that evolution. I don't think it's possible for evolution to produce the thing in the beginning. That requires information processing, but proofreading, etc. So, but the idea that it would build a system designed to maintain the integrity is counterintuitive to the idea that random change to it is what.
Yeah, you've said that a couple times now.
Hey, hold on. I got a quick question.
Guys,
there's about half a dozen.
Hold on real quick. I just got a quick question for,
guys, I kind of want to point out the paper that Standing pointed out to us has a really nice little quote in it, which I think needs to be shared with the whole class. That quote is.
Hold on for one quick second. Nephilim, can I invite my friend on, if that's okay?
I'm scared to let people that are just completely random in here that I don't have
I think at this point, there's probably enough people in the discussion. Don't you?
Okay.
Especially because now we should allow Jackson to talk. RJ has a few things to say, I think. So if we get too flooded, I don't know.
Let me explain the reason for that is because there are certain people out there who they will bomb the hangout and have it crash and you can't join it again. There's a trick they know how to do this, and if there are certain unscrupulous people that will do that, and I'm scared of people that I don't know. Now, so let me ask you this. Let me just ask you, how well do you know this person?
I've known him for a very long time.
Well, I mean, how long is a very long time?
I'll say about a few months.
Well, that's not a very long time.
Okay.
You know, I trust you because I've had you in my hangouts, I think once or twice before. You've been in the chats a lot, and you seem like a pretty square up guy. If you feel 100% confident that this guy would not do this, you can share the link with him. I'll say this in advance. If he bombs the hangout, it's a testimony against atheism. All right. Okay. Done. I'm done. All right. So go ahead. Now, I think Jackson, you were talking about.
I would like to quote the paper that Standing brought to our attention. It says, quote, "A gradual increase in homozygosity was then observed over the next 5 generations as expected from the small number of breeding pairs, 1 to 8, causing genetic drift."
Yeah, I read that word for word.
Why don't we see that in the past 4,000 years?
Well, we just seen it right here with the finches that this...
We see these finches are inbreeding and they're causing homozygosity. So why doesn't that point back to a point about 4,000 years ago when Noah and his family, a small breeding pair, got off the ark? The same with literally all other animals and all other terrestrial animals, I should say. Why do we not see that?
Are you saying that based on the animals coming? Because at the end of the day, we've only just begun documenting species this last century, and lo and behold, we see this paper where this parental species relatively heterozygous, and then the new species shifted to a state of increased homozygosity is exactly what inbreeding predicted. So
because of inbreeding,
the more we document it, the more we'll see it, I'm sure.
Because
I got to ask a source area. What's the specific paper that Jensen was citing this in, so that I can see how he's using it? Which paper is that?
Isn't it the one that you're looking at right now? No,
that's the Lamachini paper. That's the
so elegantly read from.
Paper.
Pardon?
So which one is that?
Oh, which isn't it? It's the rapid hybrid speciation in Darwin's finches. But you guys still haven't addressed the science of it and why that isn't a possibility for rapid speciation. I'm trying to tell you and give you a plausible explanation for the rapid speciation that you guys say is a fatal blow.
Apparently it didn't surprise the Grants.
Yeah,
but I'm trying to find the Jensen paper.
Well,
because I don't think I have that one in my bibliography. What's the title?
I'm not saying that this study actually established, because it never actually established whether an increase in homozygosity was, the cause or effect of the formation of this species. But
then why point it out?
Well, because for me, it's quite evident that there's no other better example.
This phenomenon was already known.
The expectation of replacing Darwin.
This paper indicates that the phenomenon.
Paper? Can you give a link to it?
Oh, the Jensen paper. Sorry, brother.
Yeah. Well, the paper itself indicates that this phenomenon was already known.
It's a second bombshell for replacing Darwin. But at the end of the day, Jackson, you're still not telling me why it's not a plausible explanation based on this. Say pre-existing heterozygosity, because it sounds like if you're starting with heterozygous organisms, visible distinctiveness in the offspring, it's going to be quick. So you're looking at recombination, gene conversion. I mean, are you denying that's not going to provide many new varieties of combination of traits? The differences are already built in. Go ahead.
I have no problem with the concept of pre-existing heterozygosity. Okay. The problem is this paper is not indicating your argument. It doesn't get you anywhere near your argument that you're attempting to make, nor does the actual genetic, nuclear, and mitochondrial DNA that we already have for a suite of species across the board indicate that 4,000 years ago, everybody started from a small breeding pair.
Okay,
this paper is making that point that they started from a small breeding pair and increased towards homozygosity.
I think the basis of this what's going on here is that Standing is arguing that, correct me if I'm wrong, that the genome by design already had variability and diversification built into it by its designer. And evolutionists claim, of course, that mechanism is an evolutionary one. So can we just agree that I just wanted to know if the evolutionists here are able to see that it follows logically that if life is designed, it makes sense that the designer would build diversification into the genome.
And that's my whole point, because for evolution, correct me if I'm wrong, Jackson, the ultimate cause of genetic change is mutation, obviously. But
hold on.
Since what we see as in regards to mutation rates, they're slow, and the number of differences in these organisms are large. So we agree that much time is going to be required to explain this current diversity. But for us, heterozygosity, say millions of differences, I'm almost done, in the DNA sequences of chromosome pairs was built into organisms by God. We're saying long periods are not required for the production of new species. So that's logically follows in regards to the biblical model, like Nephi said.
If you're going to appeal to miracles and then say we don't need to worry about evolutionary mechanisms like natural selection, genetic drift, etc., then the argument has essentially defenestrated itself. I mean, if we're just going to appeal to miracles, then we're going to appeal to miracles and we're done.
Well, we can show the miracles, but I mean, I can give arguments for them. But
so in the paper, let me ask a question here. In the Jensen paper, at any point does he lay out what the genome is of the original created finch, if he's claiming there is an originally created finch?
In the paper, he's just showing that the more, well, he's showing a valid pathway for speciation, because the more homozygous, say, this population becomes, then the less it's going to resemble, say, the original parent population. So if we're looking at these new species coming from this parental population of these finches, that's a confirmed prediction. But no, he's not.
That isn't the question.
No, he didn't.
Well, it's obvious that even evolutionists acknowledge that the various the varieties of finch on the Galapagos is something that the genome allows for, obviously. I think the real question here is
creationists didn't up until recently.
I'm not sure about that, but
the difference
probably here is, hold on, please.
Allow
the difference here really is that the evolutionists, with their uniformitarianist idea, I think has up until recently argued that it takes an incredible amount of time for this kind of variety to appear. But now when we study the finches and other species here in the 20th century and into the 21st, we see that this kind of variety can happen pretty rapidly, which is surprising if you believe what evolutionists believed in 1960.
So the point that I was trying to make earlier was that in this case of these hybrid finches, the big bird group, which I do remember now, and I'm glad actually we looked at this paper because it's a really neat paper.
We're going to have to discuss it in rocks.
In this case, we can use genetics to study the pedigree of the big bird finches. If we apply that, and that's what Jensen's talking about, I presume, is he's talking about using this pedigree to show that homozygosity has been occurring over time in this inbreeding population. Well, we should be able to infer the exact same thing for every terrestrial animal about 4,000 years ago. They should have the same marks of increased homozygosity in their genome, all leading to the
Okay, let me ask you this then.
Why don't they have that?
Well, what about your time scale? Maybe you're making assumptions about time.
Did the global flood not happen 4,000 years ago?
Well, the thing is, created heterozygosity would explain the nuclear DNA differences, and if we look at mitochondrial DNA differences, that actually fits a biblical creation model more, because the differences are too few based on the time frame for.
I don't see why an argument can be made against the variety that we see in living things today having come about.
No one's arguing against that.
I'm just giving you a plausible pathway for rapid speciation. So
Yeah, I don't think that an argument can be made, a good argument made, that the kind of variety we see in living things couldn't have arisen since the Noahic flood if we have
I think it's a very
created
plausible
times coming off the ark.
And if we look at human breeders, Jackson, haven't they produced over 800 horse breeds that have relatively...
They're all the same species.
Yes, but they only have 5 to, I don't know, 6 million nuclear DNA differences.
So you're surprised by this morphological plasticity of a single species?
Well, I'm saying if human breeders can create, say, so many species starting with relatively little genetic diversity, then shouldn't natural selection be able to generate a few species starting with relatively greater genetic potential, aka the created heterozygosity that I'm talking about?
I mean, Jensen laid out what this. Where is Jensen laid out what the range of genetic variety was in this hypothetical created finch, or was he claiming a created finch? He doesn't seem to say what he thinks. And,
well, what Dr. Jackson is saying,
Jackson's point is that every single animal on Earth would show those same traits if all animals on Earth are descended from the things on Noah's Ark. Or do you dispute that?
Okay, two things. What Dr. Jensen is saying is that most chromosomes, they encode for traits and contain differences. And if we look at the massive genetic study that I'm sure you're more than aware of, and I'm sure that you've looked at thoroughly, it revealed 90% of Earth's animals appeared at the same time. So
no, it doesn't. No, it doesn't. No, it doesn't.
No, it did not.
I
am familiar with that.
Okay,
but no,
actually,
it did not.
Standing. Let me explain that one very briefly. So what happened was there was a study, and what this study showed was that the diversity of all of like 90% of the populations started about 100,000 years ago. Not that these populations started 100,000 years ago, which means that their lineages must be at least 100,000 years old. What happened was there was a popular newspaper which ran the story that all of these species came into existence 100,000 years ago, completely getting it backwards.
No, that's not exactly accurate. No,
that's actually what happened.
What the papers say is, let me finish. What the papers are saying is that it appears that the tremendous variety of the types of living creatures, I know you don't like the biblical kind idea, have arisen in the last 200,000 years. In other words, the variety was far less,
and that's
dramatically. Let me finish.
Now,
wait a minute. We've got to have order in here. Hold on, guys. Okay, we can't talk constantly over each other. So the implication from the Christian point of view, the creationist view, is that this implies that the greatest portion of variety of living things seem to have arisen, according to the evolutionist idea, within the last 200,000 years. Now, that would certainly fly in the face of the idea that these creatures have prodiginator that came from vast ages of time. Let me give you an example of what I mean by that. There's estimated 200 to 250,000, we don't know exactly how many, proteins in a given cell, right? And in the genome of humankind, it appears that the vast majority, it's like 87%, current knowledge, of single nucleotide polymorphs in the human genome have arisen in the last 5,000 to 10,000 years. Those are changes to the protein. Sure, I'll provide it while I'm talking.
And I just want to say one thing, and then you continue, Nephi. The 100,000 figure that Jackson's talking about, it's not from genetics. It's actually from geology. Okay.
So the thing here is that if this example I'm giving, let's see here. I'm looking for the information you asked for. So the variety of single nucleotide polymorphs appear to have arisen, the vast majority of them, in the last 5 to 10,000 years, according to this science paper. And I'm posting the link to the information right there, and there's a link to the paper. Okay, so now here's the crazy problem for the evolutionist with this. This means that the codes for proteins, the vast majority of single nucleotide changes to human protein codes, seem to have arisen in 5 to 10,000 years. Now, if evolution were true, and if humans and apes had a common ancestor some 4.5 or so million years ago, that should mean that mutation to protein codes, single nucleotide polymorphs would have been going on always throughout the whole evolutionary history of all life on this planet. It does not add up that the vast majority of these kinds of changes in a human genome would arise only in the last 5 to 10,000 years. It should have been continuously going on at a relatively steady rate for millions of years in all of the creatures that are ancestors of man and ancestors of chimpanzees. So if humans and chimps had a common ancestor 4.5 million years ago, this means in the human genome, and likely also we should find that this to be probably true in the chimpanzee genome, that the vast majority of changes to the codes for proteins in both species have arisen just since humans and chimpanzees diverged anywhere from 2 to 4.5 million years ago. That doesn't add up if those creatures came from another species, from another species, from another species over vast ages of time. It should be a continuous rate. So that if you take it on its face value, this points to mankind and chimpanzees as being young species, thousands of years old. I know you won't agree with that conclusion, but that's the inference we get from that data.
No, that's not the inference.
It is.
I know you want to view it that way.
Nephi, did you actually read this paper you posted? Did you actually read this paper you posted?
Isn't there another study? Isn't there another study too that just came out that suggests we came from 2 individuals living together? And I
was just talking with someone about that just a couple weeks ago.
Okay, guys, you guys keep throwing out these papers, dropping them, and running to a new paper. Let's stick with the paper, okay? First of all, I want to.
Well, for one, you guys haven't debunked or
we have already talked about this.
Well, you haven't given us any good reason to.
You haven't given us any
that the created heterozygosity model is plausible, because it clearly is plausible.
It's not plausible because we've already asked you several times why you can look at this one species, this hybrid species of finches, and not be able to extrapolate that to all organisms about 4,000 years ago. And you've just flopped on that, and you haven't explained it. You've pointed to all these other things.
Okay, so in regards to the recent study that just came out with the 2 individuals that we all descend from, they just let me finish. They base that on the DNA barcoding, and don't you, as an evolutionist, use this type of testing of mitochondrial DNA to prove your model? So why can't we use the barcodes?
No one said you can't use it. A way to analyze DNA is a way to analyze DNA, so long as you use it as it's intended.
Exactly. So we're using it appropriately and sufficiently to demonstrate that our model is the stronger model.
It's not demonstrating that because you still haven't. You still have not provided evidence that of this huge bottleneck that occurred about 4,000 years ago. You said, hey, look at this species that went down this path. And we're saying, okay, great. This species did that. Show us now how all species did that. And you haven't.
Well, I just showed you how.
Give me that source. I want the source for that paper. Also, with regard to the 90% of animals that came in to exist, or the 90% of species have been around for the past 100,000 years.
Yeah, but that was based on geology, not genetics. So isn't that cheating?
No. Actually, that is mitochondrial DNA, not geology. And actually, here's a quote from BioLogos on it. So this is a Christian organization. It says, did the authors conclude that 90% of animal species appeared at the same time as humans? No. Here's a quote. Quote, the extant population, no matter what its current size or similarity to fossils of any age, has expanded from mitochondrial uniformity within the past 200,000 years, close quote. So the genetic diversity, the genetic mitochondrial diversity has occurred within the past 200,000 years, meaning that they descended from their most recent female common ancestor within the past 200,000 years. That's literally all that means. That's it.
Okay, obviously I'm not saying that they haven't come to their conclusions from an evolutionary perspective, but I'm saying that the 6,000 year speciation model is absolutely necessary to explain the origin of these observed mitochondrial DNA differences. Obviously,
you got some paper. I'm still trying to get back to a fundamental point. So there are X number of originally created kinds. Was there an original created finch kind, or was it another kind that had even more range that produced the finches since the flood?
How would you explain kinds to them, Neff?
That's not the question. I am asking you a specific question. Are you claiming, you can say, oh gosh, I don't know the answer to that, and no one speculated on that. That's fine. But what do you have a view? Have you thought about this?
Okay, so let me come back into this, if I may. So I stepped away for a minute to do something for my wife. So again, I posit that if single nucleotide polymorph is a genetic mechanism that's always been going on, it makes no sense that the vast majority of single nucleotide polymorphs would happen to the human genome only in the last 5 or 10,000 years. 87% or more is what the paper says. So wait a minute. Why? Can you explain to me why it's rational to believe that single nucleotide polymorph mutations, of the vast majority of them, would begin in the human genome only 5 to 10,000 years ago, if human beings have been around for 250 or up to 1 million years?
Are they not talking about the impact of various population shifts that has produced that in the last 5,000 years?
How would that?
Isn't that what the whole point of them is?
How would that prevent single nucleotide polymorphs?
It's not about preventing them. It's about it's probably about spreading them, isn't it? About spreading, and remember,
it's about deleterious ones, not non-deleterious ones.
Doesn't matter.
They're measuring something very specific here.
Doesn't matter. Why would that only happen?
Obviously, it doesn't matter to you. It doesn't matter to the rest of us.
Why would the vast majority of them only seem to begin to arise within the last 5 or 10,000 years, if human beings have been around for 240 or more thousand years?
The human population has not remained static in all of that time. They've been in varying areas. Are you saying that population demographics doesn't exist?
Why would this genetic mechanism, for the most part, begin 5 to 10,000 years?
The very paper you cite talks about out of Africa, talks about migrations
that's
out of Africa.
My question.
It's absolutely. Are you not talking about this paper you cited?
No, wait. Here's your confusing things. Look, it doesn't have anything to do. I know you think it does. It doesn't have anything to do with the fact that what shows is a correlation between the diversity of man and the single nucleotide polymorphs, right? That they seem to have arisen both around the same time when human beings diversified into what we would call modern Homo sapiens sapiens, right? So right after the last ice age, when Neanderthals began dying off, right? That's the implication, right? But the problem is, if human beings have been around for 250,000 years or more, then this is a genetic mechanism, is a random one. It's not something programmed into the genome. Why would it only have begun roughly 5 to 10,000 years ago?
If it's talking about 86% or 70%, obviously not all of them did begin then. Now, did they?
Exactly.
At least a quarter of them predate that 5,000 years, right?
Not 87% is not a quarter, but the point is,
it gave various numbers here.
I think you're avoiding the actual question. The question is, why would this mechanism of mutation exist? Why would the majority of protein codes in human beings only accept mutations, the vast majority of them only in the last 5 to 10,000 years? If Homo sapiens have existed,
this is not about all mutations, is it?
If Homo sapiens has existed for at least 250,000 years. It doesn't add up.
Are you claiming this paper was a measurement of all mutations in human beings?
Because that is not what it's about.
No, it's just a measurement of the ones that apply to that are single nucleotide polymorphs.
Bingo. So what proportion of mutations are single nucleotide ones?
A lot.
What? How long? A lot.
It's irrelevant. The point is, this mechanism.
If your mechanism is measuring something that's very small, that has occurred because of the population dynamics of the last 5,000 years of people moving around and marrying one another, and populations expanding, which they have, and cultures moving back and forth, which there have been an enormous amount of. Are you like, let me ask this question.
Wait, let him finish.
Demographer who agrees with you?
That's irrelevant. That's moving the goalpost.
Guys, this very paper.
I just want to ask one thing. I just want to clarify
what he says. Hold on.
Just real quick.
What he says. So, James, the thing is, you're not giving a logical reason why we should believe that because human beings diversify in their population, this somehow kickstarts a genetic mechanism for mutation.
Neff, this very paper talks about, here, listen to this. Thus, our simulations suggest that genes underlying disease and essential functions are more functionally constrained relative to other genes, and a bottleneck associated with the out-of-Africa dispersal led to less efficient purging of weakly deleterious alleles. We found that the average age of deleterious variants was significantly different across these genome pathways. There's the average age across pathways not very significantly when all SNVs were considered, indicating the differences observed for different deleterious variants probably represented heterogeneity of functional constraints across pathways.
None of that is an explanation as to why this mechanism should kickstart 5,000 to 10,000 years ago.
It's not saying it's not saying it's kickstarted.
That's what the evidence implies. When only
that is not what the evidence implies at all.
Okay, wait a minute. So now
we're never going to agree on this.
Here's the point. Hold on. DNA barcode didn't actually reveal we came from one couple. Like, I'm confused at your position on this.
I'm still asking you to provide that.
Hold on, guys.
Multiple couples. And by the way, when did those couples live?
Hold on, everybody. Hold on.
Well, I know the 100,000 figure was integrated into the study from a geologic assumption. So
no. Geology.
Hold on for everybody. Everybody, hold on.
There was no geology involved.
Hold on for a second. We got to hammer something down here. Wait a second. Hold on. So, diversification is not a valid reason to believe that a genetic mechanism seems to explode 5,000 to 10,000 years ago. Okay, a mechanism for mutation. If human beings as Homo sapiens have existed for 250,000 years, they should have always been having single nucleotide polymorphs occur. Isn't that correct? So now you're saying that man diversifying into various tribes 5,000 to 10,000 years ago after the last ice age is somehow a mechanism that would kickstart an explosion of single nucleotide polymorphs.
The same points.
What we need for you to explain to us is why it's logical to believe that diversification is going to kickstart a genetic mechanism for mutation.
Because you've got it wrong. There was no kickstarting. All you are looking at is a subpopulation of human beings and a subset of the genes and the subset of the mutations. You have never told us how many mutations there are and what proportion of that. Are you claiming that all mutations in all human beings originated only 4,500 years ago?
Yes, of course.
Then what evidence do you have of that? That paper certainly doesn't show that.
Well, if a single gene typically spans, say, thousands of nucleotides, and these single nucleotide variants are distributed throughout the gene, doesn't that mean that based on our model and based on the genomic position definition of alleles, say, wouldn't every single one of those exist in a heterozygous state?
On top of that, let me say this. On top of that, let me say this. It is by this very mechanism that evolutionists believe all the varying proteins in all the species of the world have arisen. It is mutation that has created the difference, the 80% difference in the proteins between humans and chimpanzees in 4.5 million years or so. It is mutation to protein codes, which has caused the diversity of proteins. That's why the proteins in the cells of a dung beetle are not going to line up with the proteins in a giraffe, because evolution has been causing this. Hold on. Because mutation has been creating new functional proteins for all this time in all species. Now, that's what we're pointing to for mankind here. The changes to protein codes in human genes have, the vast majority of them, arisen in what it seems to be 5,000 to 10,000 years. That fits.
And I again say, no, that paper did not claim
James, I'll give you the chance. Give me a moment.
You repeat the same thing over and over again, and what you're repeating is not true.
James, I'll give you the mic. Hold on. That fits a young Earth creation model that man has only been around a few thousand years. But it does not fit uniformitarianist idea, because evolutionists claim that the proteins are different in a chimp and a human being by 80%, and other creatures, all of them vary so much by this very mechanism. So you're claiming that dung beetles and giraffes and lions and all types of living things arose because mutation was creating new functional proteins by this very mechanism for all time. The problem is this mechanism, the vast majority of these kinds of changes to the human genome seem to have arisen only in 5,000 to 10,000 years. That does not match the millions
How
of
many
years
times are you going to repeat the same thing over and over again? Repeating
James,
that is not at all what this paper says.
is absolutely boring.
Then tell me Then tell me how come 80% of the proteins in human genome and a chimp genome are different by 80%, and this must have arisen in the last.
Who are the other people in the room? Can you get some of these other people in here? They've got their little microphones going on in here. Do any of you notice that? Can any of you summarize what the difference is between our two opinions, so we can find out whether or not our ideas are becoming clear to people?
Let me just ask you this question, and it clarifies exactly everything I'm saying. 80% of the proteins in a human being and a chimpanzee are different by at least one amino acid. That would be a single nucleotide polymorph that made that difference in each one of those 80% of the proteins in our genomes. Now, can you explain to me, therefore, how it's logical to believe that 80% of the proteins in a human chimpanzee genome became different in the last 5,000 to 10,000 years? Because that's exactly what would have had to have happened if it happened for humans.
This was not a report about. That paper is not about chimpanzee genomes, is it?
Intentionally not following the logic.
No, Neff, this paper that you've cited does not in any way, shape, or form support that argument.
Of course it doesn't.
Neff, hold on a second.
The article. Hold on. Question. Please, can I ask a question?
I'm not saying it does.
Please, can I ask a question?
Why did you cite it? Then why did you cite it? If it doesn't,
because this is the very mechanism that supposedly created the 80% difference.
Can I ask a question?
According to who? According to who? Not this paper.
Wait, you're saying it's not?
Ask a question.
Oh.
Not according to this paper. That's not. This paper is not.
It doesn't matter what that paper says.
Then why did you cite it?
What matters is, okay, so let me ask you a couple of questions to get to.
Oh my gosh.
Okay, are you telling me, is it not true? Is it not true that 80% of the proteins in the human?
Can I ask a goddamn question? I do not normally get angry, but I am frustrated.
James, hold on. The difference. This is not a conversation.
This is a monologue.
James, the problem is this: the evolutionists, when you point out this kind of evidence, they go ballistic and atomic on you because they can't answer for it. And so that's what you're doing, and moving the goalpost endlessly. So I'm going to ask a couple of questions to get to the meat of it. And the first question is this: is it not true that 80% of the proteins in the human genome are different by one amino acid? Right?
I cannot deal with. I am very angry. Let me tell you. Let me talk for 1 minute. Will you please let me talk for 1 minute?
Is that not true,
guys?
Will you please let me talk for 1 minute? You keep on saying you're going to let me talk, and that you never do.
And the follow-up question.
Ask his question, please.
Is it not the same mechanism that created the difference in our proteins?
Oh my God! Please, shush. The other people who have their microphones muted, will you please tell us, do you think that Nephilim keeps asking the same question over and over again and does not allow us to talk about it?
The problem is this, all right? Everybody, look, when you ask these questions, atheists don't want to answer them, so they talk over you constantly. They don't want to answer for their beliefs. That's what's going on here. So I'm having to nail it down to a series of questions to do it. All I'm hearing from you is that it's not true. That's not sufficient. Because you say it's not true doesn't wash.
Neff, we're not. Okay.
Hey, can we move the topic forward, please?
Okay, Neff, I'm going to try to explain this very carefully.
I don't let atheists move the goalpost.
No, I'm not trying to move the goalpost. Can I please just explain?
Okay, let's let Jackson talk and
please just explain.
Okay.
This paper does not mention chimpanzees or the differences
Agreed.
between humans and chimpanzees. Okay.
I never said it did.
Why did we bring it up in the first place?
You're pretending there's not a relationship between the two.
This is not this paper. This paper is not talking about the differences. It's not saying that all the differences between humans and chimpanzees.
Agreed.
Jackson, why did you say that it did?
Because you're refusing to acknowledge the relationship, and that's the thing. That's why I wanted to ask a couple of questions.
And what is your question?
The question is this. Is it not true that single nucleotide polymorphs are the mechanism which would have created this 80% difference in the human proteins in chimpanzees? Isn't that the mechanism?
It's not the only one, no.
It's only one? It's the one that changed the amino acid strings so that they're different between humans and chimpanzees. Is it not true? Are you going to tell me single nucleotide polymorphs is not?
Happened. It is a part of what happened, but it is not the only thing that happened.
There we are. Great. Scott's science denial right off the bat.
Excuse me? You are aware that gene duplication is right?
I just want
to know. So this is the thing.
See, recognize that gene duplications happen?
Nucleotide polymorph is the most common.
Well, gene duplications would certainly be much more deleterious to the genome than any. I don't think gene duplications.
That's not what the ice fish says.
See, what's happening here is the evolutionists are denying what they believe about mutation in order to prevent from acknowledging that it's astonishing that we should find that the vast majority of these kinds of mutations to human protein codes have resulted only in the last 5,000 to 10,000 years. That's what's going on.
Nephi, I just want to ask Jack, because in regards to gene duplication, let's just say let's just say a given gene, whatever it is, has been accumulating deleterious mutations, say for a long time, it would be in a partially degenerated state. So if we duplicate that gene, the deleterious mutations are duplicated with it. So is that actually, for one, going to slow down the deleterious process? And is that, secondly, going to build the genome? Is that a mechanism that's going to take your fish to fishermen is what I'm saying?
Do you acknowledge that gene duplications happen, and do you know how they happen? Do you think that your explanation of them is how they normally happen? And if so, what literature can you cite that is how they normally happen?
So, Jackson, now you're telling us that single nucleotide polymorphs is not the mechanism by which
did I say that it wasn't?
Changes.
Did I say that it wasn't?
You seem to have been arguing against that.
I am not arguing against that.
Is that not true?
So this is the third time I've probably said that.
So Jackson, is it not true then?
Can you clearly state what you're saying about it then, because so they can hear it?
Jackson, is it not true that single nucleotide polymorphs is the mechanism which has changed the majority of proteins in human beings and chimpanzees so that they're different by 80%?
It is a mechanism. It is one of the mechanisms.
Is it not the prepondering mechanism, the vast majority of changes?
For the sake of argument, let's say yes.
Yes. You see, your refusal to acknowledge that it absolutely is the overwhelming mechanism that causes that changes is where you catch atheists denying science. They'll deny what they believe. They'll deny what they believe until you catch it.
Can you please just move on? I said yes, so let's move on.
Jackson, here's the thing. If I hadn't brought this paper up, you would have been happy to acknowledge that single nucleotide polymorphs is what accounts for the 80% difference between human and chimpanzee.
Oh my God, this paper had nothing to do with that.
It doesn't matter.
What the Okay,
that doesn't matter.
No.
You would have been happy to. But the fact that you're now
you just said.
Okay, let's get back.
Hold on.
Okay, let's switch gears.
You just said
you're now arguing
on the heterozygosity.
Wait, everybody quiet. The fact that you're now arguing that maybe it's one mechanism. I didn't say it.
You just admitted. You just admitted that this paper you brought up had nothing to do with your point.
Jackson,
You just admitted this paper had nothing to do with your point.
No, it has everything to do with it.
You just admitted that it didn't.
It doesn't directly address it. It has everything to do with it.
Jackson, how rare is a gene duplication event? Is it a common event?
Do you recognize that he cited this paper saying that it proves his argument? I said it doesn't, and he said it doesn't matter. like 3 times.
It's related to the same.
That's literally what
argument.
you said now.
It's related to the same argument of the origin.
It's not related to the same argument. This paper I'm trying to point out has nothing to do with that.
Absolutely has everything to do with it.
That is about a subset of the human population and a subset of mutations, and you're trying to say this holds true for all humans as well as chimpanzees.
Jackson, it has everything to do with it because single nucleotide polymorph is the mechanism by which evolutionists claim 80% of the chimpanzee genome relating to protein codes, 80% of the protein codes in chimpanzees and humans became different over the last 4.5 million years. That is the mechanism. Okay,
what is the mechanism?
Has nothing
what is the mechanism that's going to...
I have one last thing to say. Nothing you have said has had anything to do with this paper, and I appreciate you for having me on, but I'm going to have to go maybe try alcohol for the first time because of this. Thank you again for having me on. It was nice talking to you as always. Nice to see you standing.
Well, Jackson, I'm glad you came. I just wish you didn't have to.
Thank you, or nice to meet you, Jay. And
thanks, Jackson.
Nice to see you guys.
And stay tuned, and tell James I'm looking forward to our debate on Wednesday. It should be fun.
Okay, all right. See you guys later. Have a nice night.
Okay, Effie, did you want to explain slowly to the audience so they understand why everything you were saying was important in context to what we were talking about in regard to the studies? Because they had a right-out refusal to acknowledge that our created heterozygosity hypothesis is a plausible mechanism and pathway for the biodiversity we see.
I do. If you understand what I'm talking about, you should understand, you should have been able to see that the evolutionists in the room were immediately attempting to deny their own theory in order to protect it against the evidence that the vast majority of single nucleotide polymorphs, these are mutations that change a single nucleotide in the DNA, have arisen in the human genome in the last 5,000 or 10,000 years. That's shocking evidence. It doesn't comport with evolution theory, with the vast ages of evolution.
Well, nothing about genetics does.
Well, of course. So here's what happened. They were arguing. I asked them, I said, how do you explain then that the vast majority of changes to the protein codes in human genome has seemed to have arisen in the last 5 to 10,000 years? Jay went off on, well, that doesn't mean all of them. No, of course not. Why the majority? I'm talking about the majority. It should not be that if human beings have existed as Homo sapiens for 4.5 million years, or even 250,000 years, that for some reason they would have been, our genome would have relatively few, very few single nucleotide polymorphs all that time, and then suddenly this mechanism explodes in human genome 5 to 10,000 years ago. That a tremendous number of single nucleotide polymorphs would arise. Jay said, well, humans diversified, that's why. I asked him, well, how in the world does human breeding and population creation create, not spread? You can only spread what's already there. That's not a mechanism for making it. How does that create or induce single nucleotide polymorphs? He wouldn't answer that and went off on a diatribe about something else. So, and then...
Well, the thing is, they hold to their worldview no matter what the evidence says, no matter, even if it's from a secular source.
See, the thing is, if human beings have been around for 2,500,000 years, single nucleotide polymorphs would have had to have been going on at a relatively steady rate all that time, not just in humans, but in the thing we came from, and the thing that it came from, and it came from, and it came from, because that is supposedly the mechanism, as I pointed out, which has created all the proteins in the dung beetle, the giraffe, the lion, the crocodile. That's why you can't take the proteins out of a crocodile and put them in a frog and the thing survive. It will die. If you were able to do that, just replace them, the organism dies, because the vast majority of the proteins in a crocodile are not the same as those in a frog or in a giraffe or in a human being or in an egret. They're not going to line up. Evolution by single nucleotide polymorph has created the tremendous diversity of protein codes in all the living types of things in the world. That would have had to have been ongoing constantly for evolution to produce a tree of life, to produce all those creatures. It supposedly created human beings and chimpanzees 4,500 million years ago, right? So and then they went off on denying that mechanism should have been always going on.
Well, the thing is, and that's why I accurately explain their mutation as their cause for genetic change. But for us, and everything that we were talking about at first, this heterozygosity, say the millions of differences in DNA sequences of chromosome pairs, if they were actually built into organisms and front-loaded into organisms from the beginning, visible distinctiveness is going to be quick. And an unlimited amount of variety and combination of traits are going to rise quickly since the differences are already built in. So our model is actually more plausible and more empirical than theirs, because everything you stated triggered them to the point where
they blew up
and Jackson left.
Absolutely. They blew up and they got nuclear on you. And the reason they went nuclear is because of this. And here's the thing. If you know me, you know I just don't let them get away with it. When I saw them denying their own theory that this should have been going on at a relatively steady rate throughout the history of every type of living thing, every genus of life on this planet throughout millions and millions upon hundreds of millions of years, and then showed that this evidence that they just exploded. They began denying the idea that single nucleotide polymorphs is what explains why chimpanzees and humans, 80% of our proteins don't align. They're not the same. And that's when they go into deny my own theory in order to protect it against evidence that appears on its face value to say man has only been around 5,000 to 10,000.
Well, they have to protect their theory at all costs, because even in regards to genetic entropy, the accumulation of these near neutral mutations into the genome, it's like they have to ignore the evidence. And I love how I'll spend hours arguing with these evolutionists on one example of a mutation adding a net gain in information in the genome, when realistically they need to provide 10,000 examples of adaptation just to address the key issue, which is net gain versus net loss. So everything about the evolutionary theory is anti-science and anti-common sense. And
as we just
they got triggered, I'm not surprised one bit. I'm actually excited because that RJ guy, he's the one I'm debating on Wednesday. But what's amazing is it's going to be a moderated debate. So his academic pride, he's not going to be able to use it. And if he wants to show off his academic pride the way he did today, and yell and scream in his rebuttal periods, it's not going to look good.
No,
I'm just going to provide the evidence.
I think he was just getting upset. That's all it was.
Right, but he was getting upset because I was not allowing him to deny his theory in order to support it, to protect it against this evidence that mankind has only been around 5,000 or 10,000 years. See, so with one science paper from the journals, I refuted their evolution theory. They got nuclear about it because it angered them so much. Why did they get angry? Because they clearly saw that it's not logical that the vast majority of changes to human protein codes should have arisen only in the last 5,000 or 10,000 years if man has been around for a quarter million years or more.
Well, I'll say this. I think you have to, I don't know. It's a certain way that you have to bring that about, because I don't know if everyone saw that. You know what I'm saying?
Well, the thing is, if you know me, I just don't let evolutionists get away with skirting evidence. I never do that. And if they blow up,
well, if they're going to move the goalposts, I mean, you definitely have to.
I understand.
And the thing is about the study, because I just want to clear it up, and I said it a few times, but they're just so ignorant. And I've read it, but I've got a friend who has connections with Dr. Jensen who has read it 5-10 times. And the 100,000 figure that Jackson was talking about was actually from geology, but the barcodes that I was talking about, that was from genetics. So the fact that they, integrated their geologic assumptions into the genetic research exposes their incredible evolutionary bias.
It does.
To the actual data.
And let me just point this out. what just happened here a little while ago is exactly why I can't find an atheist, an evolutionist, except for the occasional guy that doesn't have 10,000 subscribers to debate me in a structured debate, because they know I'm going to provide this kind of an evidence, and they won't be able to counter it with their ideas. The audience will see that the evidence doesn't support their millions of years, but it supports a young Earth and a young lifespan for mankind. They won't have a rebuttal for it in a structured debate. They won't be able to give a plausible explanation.
No, they won't.
And to be able to deny science right in front of a whole audience, and that's why it's hard for me to find somebody to debate me.
I'm finding it hard too. It was actually because I gave Modern Day Hysteria a month to find an opponent, because I've done about 20 discussions. I wanted Steve McRae, and Steve McRae wouldn't answer my emails. And then he finally answered an email. He wanted me to debate one of his scientist friends or something. Then finally, RJ Downard agreed to have the debate. But with Jackson and RJ, you'll notice they often appeal to the fossil record. They often appeal to these bones found in the dirt. But the thing is, bones and fossils aren't inherited. Traits are. And when we look at genetics, that's the fatal blow to evolution. So they can go on and on and on about the fossil record and the stories that go along with it. But if I'm looking at our genome and at a molecular level, and I can prove that your fairy tale evolutionary story is false, it doesn't matter what bone you throw at me. It's all circular.
And it doesn't. It is, and it doesn't. It's exactly right. It's circular, and it doesn't matter what presumptions or assumptions they bring. That's what you're exactly right. Genetics by itself unequivocally brings a sledgehammer down on top of evolution and smashes it like a roach. Its evolution cannot be true because of the very existence of the DNA molecule itself. So it's modern science versus an antiquated, unscientific idea born in the day when men rode horses to work and lighted streets with oil lamps. And modern science has destroyed it with modern genetics and other things. And as you pointed out, the fossil record doesn't show the transitions.
No, it doesn't. And lastly, Nephi, I enjoyed the conversation. Hopefully we can do this again soon. Hopefully we can set up another 2-on-2 discussion. I got to get going. Is it okay if I upload this conversation onto my channel? Actually,
sure, mirror it all you like.
Yeah, I'm gonna mirror it. I thought it was actually fun. It was amazing how triggered they got based on the evidence. But Neff, thanks for having me on, brother. I love you. God bless.
All right, man. Thanks so much. Appreciate you, bro.
Man. We'll talk to you later. Bye.
Take care.